I am here today to make a plea for history, to say that history is not something about the past. No, history from the African point of view is something which allows you to have self-respect. It helps you to have a reclaimed identity. It helps you to assert yourself on the social, political and cultural agenda today. So it's a very, very important thing, and in my view, it's been overlooked wrongly. It's very fashionable to talk about education. Education is important. It's the most empowering thing you can give a young child in Africa, and it's true. But what kind of education? Quality education is the thing that's very important, and history is an integral part of that. And not just for people living in Africa, but also the established African diaspora, be it in the Caribbean, be it in Brazil, be it in the United States, whether it's also the more recently arrived diaspora Africans living in the West. All part and parcel of the same history. It's a shared history. It doesn't matter where you live in the world. You are of African descent. Be you, in Brazil, where, by the way, a lot of people don't realize that around 100 million Brazilians, that's about more than 50% of the population, either have African heritage or mixed African heritage. They are the second largest African population after Nigeria, or the African American diaspora, the most powerful and influential diaspora of Africans in the world. Our history is about identity. It's about self-respect. It's about claiming our own narrative. So it's that oneness of the disparate community. It's bringing everybody together under, one banner. Only when lions have historians will the hunters cease to be heroes.
At the timeline. The first thing you need to know about ancient Egyptian history is that it is divided into 31 numbered dynasties. So this is what the numbers represent on the timeline. For example, if you want to know when the fourth dynasty of Egypt was, the answer is between approximately 2600 BCE and 2500 BCE. The second thing you need to know is that there were 3 times throughout ancient Egyptian history in which Egypt really flourished. These are called the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And they are shown on the chart in red, purple, and blue. In between and after these kingdoms, there were 3 intermediate periods in which Egypt was in decline. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is the map. The most important thing to notice here is that there are actually 2 Egypts, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. At first, it might seem strange that Lower Egypt is at the top and Upper Egypt is at the bottom. But this is because the terms refer to their placement along the Nile River. The river flows north, so Lower Egypt is located downstream and Upper Egypt is located upstream. Originally, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt were 2 separate kingdoms. Pharaohs from Lower Egypt wore a red crown that looked like this, and the pharaohs from Upper Egypt wore a white crown that looked like this. However, when the 2 kingdoms were united, a combined crown was created. So the next time you see a picture of a rock carving from Egypt, pay attention to the headwear. You'll notice that you see this double crown displayed a lot. The main city in Lower Egypt was Memphis, located near modern-day Cairo. Most of the large pyramids that we associate with ancient Egypt are located in this area. The main city in Upper Egypt was Thebes, near modern-day Luxor. You won't find any pyramids near Luxor. However, this is the area in which the famous Valley of the Kings is located, where King Tut's tomb was found. Okay, so now that you understand the basics about the time periods and the geography around 3100 BCE, everything before this is considered the pre-dynastic period. The first dynasty started when a pharaoh named Narmer, or Menes, united Lower and Upper Egypt for the first time. But during the first two dynasties, ancient Egypt was still in its infancy. It wasn't until the third dynasty that things really took off. The third dynasty marked the beginning of the Old Kingdom, which lasted through to the end of the sixth dynasty. The Old Kingdom was centered on Lower Egypt, and it was the period during which the largest and most famous pyramids were built. The first of these was built for a pharaoh named Djoser, and was designed by an architect named Imhotep. To the right of the timeline is a chart showing the 12 largest pyramids in order. The Pyramid of Djoser came in at number 11, but about 50 years later, we get a pharaoh named Sneferu, who founded the fourth dynasty, the most important of the Old Kingdom dynasties. Sneferu built 3 major pyramids, which come in at numbers 3, 4, and 5. They are the Red Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, and the Meidum Pyramid, also known as the Collapsed Pyramid, as it, collapsed, and only the inner portion can be seen today. At this point, let's go down to the bottom of the chart, where I have some family tree diagrams. You can see here that Sneferu was the father of Khufu, who was the builder of the largest pyramid of all, the Great Pyramid at Giza. Khufu was followed by 2 of his sons, both of whom also built large pyramids. However, only the Pyramid of Khafre exists today. The Pyramid of Djedefre is known as the Lost Pyramid and was either never finished or was perhaps destroyed at some later point. The dynasty continued through Khafre and his son Menkaura. Menkaura started to build his own pyramid, but it was actually finished by his son Shepsetkef. If we go back up to the pyramid photos, you can see the various pyramids that I just mentioned. So the Great Pyramid of Khufu comes in at number 1, with an original height of about 480 feet. That's about the height of a 50-story building. The Pyramid of Khafre, which is located right next to Khufu's, is just a little bit shorter. However, it stands out because it's the one that is right behind the Sphinx. The Sphinx is, of course, one of the most interesting statues in the ancient world, and there are all sorts of crazy theories about it. However, according to mainstream historians, it was simply built by the same pharaoh who built the pyramid right next to him, Khafre. The third of the 3 pyramids at Giza is the one that Khafre's son Menkaure started to build, and which was finished by his son Shepsetkef. It's about half the size of the other 2 Giza pyramids and comes in at number 9. That Lost Pyramid I mentioned earlier, built by Khafre's older brother Djedefre, was likely around the same size as the Menkaure Pyramid. So I've placed it on the chart at number 10. Okay, let's now return to the timeline. Around 200 BCE, a major climate event occurred known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. It caused super dry conditions worldwide, and this is probably what caused the fall of the Old Kingdom. At this point, Egypt experienced its first intermediate period, during which Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt eventually split. But the 2 kingdoms were united again by a pharaoh named Menuhotep II of the 11th dynasty, and thus the Middle Kingdom was born, which lasted through to the end of the 13th dynasty. Of the 3 Middle Kingdom dynasties, the 12th is the most important. It was during the 12th dynasty that pyramid building resumed. However, the Middle Kingdom pyramids weren't able to rival those of the Old Kingdom. And in fact, most of them are in pretty bad shape today. The largest are the pyramids of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, which come in at numbers 6 and 7. The Middle Kingdom came to an end around 1700 BCE, when the 2 Egypts split up once again. It was during this second intermediate period that a foreign people group from West Asia entered Egypt and took control. They are known as the Hyksos, and they ruled Lower Egypt as the 15th dynasty. However, Pharaoh Ahmose I, founder of the 18th dynasty, was eventually able to expel the foreign Hyksos, reunite Egypt, and establish the new kingdom, centered on Thebes in Upper Egypt. The new kingdom was the greatest of the three ancient Egyptian kingdoms and is sometimes referred to as the Egyptian Empire, since it was during the new kingdom that Egypt reached its peak in terms of its size, power, and influence. In fact, most of the pharaohs whose names are still well known today, such as Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses, are New Kingdom pharaohs coming from either the 18th or the 19th dynasties. I've already done 1100 BCE, which is about the same time as the Bronze Age collapse, an event which saw the demise of the Mycenaean Greeks as well. At this point, Egypt starts to frequently become ruled by foreign powers, such as the Libyan pharaohs of Dynasty 21 and the Kushite, or so-called Black Pharaohs of Dynasty 25. It then fights several wars with both Assyria and Babylon, only to be defeated in the end by the Achaemenid Persians, who are dynasties 27 and 31. The numbered dynasties come to an end in the year 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. Shortly thereafter, Egypt ended up being controlled by the Ptolemies, which ruled until the time of Cleopatra, after which Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire. So keep in mind that the history of ancient Egypt is really long.
This is Tutankhamun, commonly referred as King Tut. He ruled during the 18th dynasty of Kemet. He was the son of Pharaoh Akhenaten, one of the most famous pharaohs, and the grandson of Amenhotep III and his royal spouse Queen Tut. You can see them on screen right now. Their phenotype is quite obvious and is consistent throughout all of their depictions. He took the throne at the tender age of 8 or 9 and ruled under the viziership of his eventual successor, Pharaoh I. Numerous studies prove that him and his relatives were genetically linked to the black populations of Africa. But mainstream media keep portraying him like this. As you can see, it has nothing to do with his depictions. As if these specialists and artists simply decided to depict whatever they had in mind and skip all the beautiful pieces created by the indigenous Kemites. Evidence that there is clearly an agenda behind all that work. A deliberate attempt to falsify the truth related to that ancient civilization. That's why we decided to recreate his face, by combining data taken from his mummy and all of his official depictions made by his own people. Here's the result.
You champion kings and queens.
That's right.
How come you ain't got any kings and queens right now? The history people. They did that thing, then they died, or they got run out of town, or killed. Where's the now people that do things now? We're always talking about what's been, never what is. What the people gonna do?
By the victor, and the victorious will often attempt to wipe out every trace of their enemy's existence. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of lost civilizations that have succumbed to collapse, invasion, or amalgamation, and a plethora of lost languages. Miseducation and indoctrination has long been a tool of conquerors to influence the hearts and minds of a population. Under our current system of capitalism, this strategy was instrumental in the Western world's rise to glory. A new tactic was employed for the first time in recorded history, which was chattel slavery. Slavery has existed since the beginning of time, and indentured servitude has been employed widely. But this new iteration of slavery was extremely cruel and barbaric by comparison. During the 15th and 16th centuries, European royalty was vastly outnumbered by commoners and slaves. In order to maintain power, they created a caste system to keep people divided. It is in this space where European elites conceptualize the contemporary concepts of class and race.
During the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count. That's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they can do the math. They added it up and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who are enslaved Africans and these quote unquote white folks who are poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all get played by these rich people, right? So ultimately the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans.
In order for this new form of slavery to operate smoothly, they had to completely dehumanize Africans, so they were seen as nothing more than animals. They had to convince the world that they were savages and had no culture or civilization. They did this by creating the myth of the Dark Continent to justify colonialism and legitimize the enslavement of Africans. They created the term sub-Saharan to suggest black Africans were only present below the Sahara. But if you look closely at the historical record, you will see that they are in fact indigenous to the entire continent and prevalent within the Mediterranean as well.
When referring to black Africans, the term sub-Saharan is also slightly inappropriate for the period, which is why I'm not using it, as black people weren't only present south of the Sahara Desert, and there is a lot of evidence for that. In the classical period instead, the Mediterranean is seen as a unified sea, used and exploited by Greeks and Phoenicians, just to mention a few, to colonize, but also to trade. The Mediterranean Sea is a connection to Africa, not a barrier. Now, because of this, the Cretan world had a documented presence of black people, which we find in the Minoic civilization, and the same can be said also about the Mycenaean world of mainland Greece. We see black individuals in Minoan representations of the Bronze Age, and because of the extreme diversity of representations, musicians, warriors, traders, etc., we can understand that they had entered fully into the Minoan social fabric. And as we said, we have a very similar situation with the Mycenaean world, starting from the 14th century BC, and by the 9th century, this would be commonplace.
In the south, he conquered the Delta region, uniting Lower and Upper Kemet. Upper Kemet would serve as the political, spiritual, and power center of the nation. Lower Kemet in these times were inhospitable, and the Delta was but a wet marshland. But in the seasonally dry channels of the Second Cataract, early African farmers learned to manage parts of the river's annual flood. This knowledge would be transferred into Kemet's wide floodplain, giving rise to the early Nakata civilization in Upper Kemet. They used the thousands of years of accumulated knowledge to accurately predict the flood season and transfer the wet marshlands of the Delta into the world's most fertile farmland. They would also use this knowledge to build the Great Pyramids. Their mastery of sacred geometry allowed them to align the Great Pyramids nearly perfectly along the cardinal points, north, east, south, and west, within 1/15th of a degree of true north. Although each was their own nation with its own identity, Tamari, Tanechi, and Taseti were connected culturally, commercially, and spiritually. Cultural exchange between these three Nile Valley civilizations was fluid. The emergence of Kemet was an evolution of African science, philosophy, and agriculture, which seeded the very foundations of civilization.
And said that the Egyptians were the faultless people. They said that they were the greatest people on earth, the most beautiful people on earth. They went to Egypt. Greek mathematicians went to Egypt to study mathematics. Pythagoras spent 23 years studying math in Egypt. The Pythagorean theorem, A squared plus B squared equals C squared, was used in Kemet to build the pyramid at least 2,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Hippocrates, the Greek father of medicine, acknowledges Imhotep as the father of medicine. Imhotep was the designer of the step pyramid at Saqqara. The columns that are referred to as Greek columns, you can find them at Saqqara. So the elements of Greek design, Roman design, Greek philosophy all had their beginnings in ancient Kemet or Egypt. Around 1919, Breasted wrote an incredible book that documented his travels in Egypt and described ancient Egyptians as dark-skinned people with woolly hair who were not unlike the Nubians who live in Egypt now. Well, this book was called Ancient Times, and it was a favorite book of John D. Rockefeller. He read it to his children all the time. And then Rockefeller decided to fund Breasted, gave him $1.5 million to establish the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. But he also had caveats with that contribution, in that the second edition of Ancient Times, which was published around 1935, Breasted removed all references to the ancient Egyptians as being dark-skinned people. And he added a new chapter where he said that they were members of the great white race. Most of what we know about Egypt is viewed through Greek and Roman eyes. Egypt is Greek word. Sphinx is Greek word. Pyramid is Greek word. Mm-hmm. So until we can begin to interpret this indigenous African culture and civilization through an African lens, then we will always view them from a disadvantage. But there's George Reisner, who excavated in Sudan, and so many others who saw the historical truth, saw that Black people who have been marginalized in this country and around the world, who have been enslaved because Pope Eugenius IV said that Black people had no souls. So people did not look upon us as people who created anything of value. So I can understand how racists would say, oh no, well, these buildings cannot be built by Black people. They don't have intelligence. These Black people cannot have written these great scripts. So they were operating under a false system of white superiority. So when they were confronted with the historical reality, they suffered what's referred to in psychology as an identity quake, cognitive dissonance. They couldn't connect the dots, so they fabricated historical lies.
Egyptology has its origins with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte in the late 18th century. Napoleon's army would defeat the Ottoman Empire at a time when European colonism was nearing its zenith. The Ottoman Empire, also known as the Turkish Empire, rose to prominence in the 12th century with the help of the Mamluks. The Mamluks, which translates to one who is armed, were an Eastern European population of slave soldiers who overthrew their rulers and came into power. In 1798, Napoleon led the French army into Egypt, swiftly conquering Alexandria and Cairo. The Battle of the Pyramids marked the beginning of the end, 7 centuries of Ottoman and Mamluk rule in Egypt. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, he brought along an army of scholars whose studies during French occupation became the foundation of Egyptology. This field of study was employed to promote the idea of European imperialism. Jean-Léon Gérome's painting, Bonaparte Before the Sphinx, captures Napoleon's instinct that the glory of ancient Egypt would be harnessed to exalt French colonial power.
Came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible, and it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts.
German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt discovered the famous bust of Queen Nefertiti in a region of Egypt called Tel El Amarna. It would later be unveiled to the general public in 1923 at the Egyptian Museum of Berlin in Germany and became the standard of beauty and a cultural symbol for Berlin and Egypt alike. However, the sculpture has been the subject of heated debates, and many scholars have gone on record to question its authenticity. After 20 years of research, Henry Sterrett, the Swiss historian, made the shocking revelation that the bust of Nefertiti is actually a fraud. And in the documentary, The Mysteries of the Nefertiti Bust, he lays out the compelling evidence.
What first made the academics suspicious was the exceptional state of conservation of Nefertiti's bust when it was discovered. The object was incongruous and bore no resemblance to any other 3,300-year-old busts from Egypt. To historian Henri Sterlin, the bust of Nefertiti is simply too well preserved, or as he puts it, too new to be true. Numerous archaeologists, Americans, Italians, French, have expressed their doubts about whether the bust is genuine, but none of them have made their doubts official. So we've decided to stage our own inquiry. Borchardt is very precise in his notes from the dig. He states he found large quantities of pigments, adding they were all still quite usable. But if this was an experimental copy, how is it Borchardt never spoke of it to his team, nor in his meticulous notes? Later, he proudly shows their highnesses the fruits of his labor. In an excess of zeal, one of the dig foremen, an Egyptian called Senussi, disappears briefly during the visit, then returns with a bust of Nefertiti. The royals are delighted with such a masterpiece, and a photograph immortalizes the moment, leaving Borchardt apparently no time to explain it was a copy and not the real thing. Henri Sterlin claims the photo is what trapped the archaeologist. You couldn't just tell the royal visitors who are enthusing over the object, listen.
The Germans were coming about with a philosophy to justify further expansion, colonialism and imperialism. And in an attempt to do that, they claimed to be the discoverers of many sets of different artifacts, one of them being this head. But in fact, what it was something created at the time or just afterwards to justify their ideas of colonialism and imperialism.
But this was far from an isolated incident. In 2018, paleo artist Elizabeth Days unveiled a facial reconstruction based on the fraudulent Nefertiti bust, which further Europeanized her features. And in 2005, Dr. Zahi Hawass, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, announced the results of a digital reconstruction of the face of Queen Nefertiti's son, King Tutankhamun. However, the relief on the back of his royal throne of him and his wife, Queen Ankhesenamun, shows a dark brown skin tone and features that resemble populations found in modern-day Sudan and the Horn of Africa. With discrepancies so glaringly obvious, one has to wonder what other liberties have been taken behind closed doors. A concerted effort has also been made in Hollywood to watch ancient Kemet. Television and film have promoted the idea of the European Egypt for decades. But when we look at the temple walls, we see a melanated population with a variety of skin tones and hairstyles, such as afros, waves, braids, and locks. Indeed, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and translation of the ancient hieroglyphs, originally known as Medu Neter, made Western scholars rethink their narrative. The newly transcribed inscriptions revealed an advanced culture that had attained an exceptionally high level of development. They coined the term Sub-Saharan Africa as a way to separate the genius of Egypt from the rest of the continent.
Sub-Saharan, that whenever they ask any question, what they're trying to do is prove that Sub-Saharan Africans aren't part of the ancient Mediterranean world, which we know is false. Not only do we know, of course, that people that we would call quote-unquote Sub-Saharan Africans ruled Egypt before the Persians got there, among others, but that they had this continual culture that runs up and down the Nile. And we know from our ancient sources that they believed very firmly, and they interacted with what in the area they called Libya, right?
Sheikh Anta Diop was a Senegalese historian and anthropologist. He was a firm believer that the ancient Egyptians were in fact black. According to his research, the skulls of ancient Egyptians had physical features resembling the peoples of the Upper Nile region, East Africans, and Nubians, all visibly black populations. But his theories aren't shared by all experts on the matter. We spoke to Dr. Zahi Hawass, an award-winning, world-renowned archaeologist. His life's work has been dedicated to the discovery and research of ancient Egyptian antiquities. Not surprisingly, his office is full of books on the topic, some of which depict dark-skinned ancient Egyptians. But he says there's an explanation.
No, they were dark-skinned,
but they were not black.
But they are not Negro. Because look at the length of the Negroes like that and the rose like this. It's not really the Egyptian origin at all. It's different, completely different. And this is why you cannot connect the Egyptian civilization with the African at all. It's different. Or from Cerebral time, Mesopotamia, it's different, completely.
During an interview on BBC News Africa, Dr. Zahi Hawass illustrates Egyptology's reluctance to acknowledge black African presence in ancient Egypt.
When asked about the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians, he describes them as being uniquely Egyptian.
You cannot make any test. There is some studies to see that the shade of the skull looks like African. But still, you will never put a final decision about the origin of the ancient Egyptian at all, because you need really to make a very comprehensive study by DNA, and this will take a long time.
So how African the ancient Egyptians were still remains a matter of debate for some, even if UNESCO scholars now say the matter is settled, and that the pharaohs and their people must be placed firmly within the black African context.
Africans as people whose biological histories have emerged and their identities have emerged in Africa, and where any mixing that took place on African soil. The Egyptians did not come from any place else other than the Nile Valley. Their identities and any other ancestry that they may have had were all forged together in that space.
In those ancient times, Egyptians called themselves Remet in Kemet, which means the people of the Black Land. Inscriptions refer to their origins being the land of Punt, which is present-day Somalia and northern Kenya. They point to these southeastern regions as being their ancestral homeland. Seti was the earliest Great Nile Valley civilization and stretched from Nubia to Upper Kemet.
3400 BC.
Mm-hmm. But before that, the climate was different.
Yes, it was more moderate. There were seasonal rains, and at the site that I studied, the ancient site that I studied, Nabta Playa, even that would fill up seasonally as a seasonal lake bed. We call it a playa. The cattle cult and the Sirius and the cattle iconography was very important to them, as well as in ancient Egypt, which came later. So there are many elements, clearly, of the culture that was operating at Nabta Playa in the earlier time that moved to the Nile Valley and became the ancient Egyptian dynastic civilization.
The Stone Circle is the world's oldest astronomical site located in modern-day Sudan. Nabta Playa emerged in the Nubian desert as a regional ceremonial center during the Middle Neolithic period. Archaeological studies have identified hundreds of the hearths, cultural debris, and numerous mummified cattle, which represented wealth and power amongst the people of the time. Ancient Africans studied the precession of the equinox from as early as 9000 BC to around 3400 BC at the site of the Nabta Playa. This is where geometry and the concept of pi was developed, as well as the world's earliest evidence of pastoral life. Archaeological evidence reveals these populations were Black Africans who were indigenous to the entire continent of Africa, not just below the Sahara.
At about 3500 BC, the monsoon rains pattern moved further south. So Nabta Playa region became extreme desert and had to be abandoned. And that's when the culture, the ancient Egyptian dynastic culture that shows many of the same elements pops up in the Nile Valley.
So you're suggesting maybe these people migrated north?
Yes.
Extreme weather conditions forced both populations of the Green Sahara and the Nabta Playa to migrate to the Nile Valley, and with them, they brought the traditions of cattle worship, mummification, geometry, and the study of the stars. When the Nabta Playa region dried up due to the rapid climate change, these populations migrated following the flow of the Nile River, bringing with them their knowledge and high science.
The dynastic civilization in the Nabta Playa region were black African people. There were monuments, temples in Old Kingdom Egypt that were rebuilt to track the rising of Sirius as it moved. With their alignment of the temples was rebuilt to track the rising Sirius as it moved through precession motion. And we found the same thing at Nabta Playa. These megalithic stone alignments, they tracked the rising of Sirius and other stars as they moved through precession.
These Africans from the south would move into what would later become Upper Kemet and establish the early pharaonic dynasties.
I like to follow the evidence, and to me, I didn't care about which race of humans it was at the time.
In the 8th century BC, when indigenous Africans of Kush came into Kemet, which had fallen on hard times, it was invaded by Libyans and Assyrians and others. They came into Kemet to restore the land of their ancestors. Those were their specific words, to restore the land of their ancestors. And for approximately 100 years, 5 African rulers, Kushite rulers, came into Kemet, drove out the foreigners, and then rebuilt Kemetic culture and civilization.
The Libyans, who'd fought for the Egyptians as mercenary generals, gradually infiltrated Egypt's power structure and eventually took power as the 22nd dynasty. Egypt's Libyan rulers understood that lucky and acting Egyptian would help to keep the country under their control. Yet in some ways, these images are simply window dressing, lip service to ancient Egyptian traditions in order to claim a greater prize. For the Libyans had organised nothing less than the state-sponsored plundering of Egypt's royal tombs. They were so transfixed by the wealth, by the gold and the bling of ancient Egypt. They wanted it for themselves, and over their several centuries' rule, while they appeared to look like pharaohs and to rule as pharaohs, Egypt never feels to have been a cohesive, united kingdom. They weren't Egyptians at heart, and that's really what mattered. Egypt needed a regime that could reconnect with its most powerful asset, its history. And by 747 BC, that's what happened, when the Kushite rulers of Nubia made a direct spiritual connection with Egypt's glorious past.
The religious and cultural ties of Kemet and Nubia run deep. So in 747 BC, when the Libyans occupied Kemet, Nubians from the kingdom of Kush marched north to restore law and order. Kemet was weak from being invaded repeatedly by the nomads. But when the Kushites arrived, it wasn't to ravage or destroy. They saw this as an opportunity to seize power and restore Kemet to its former glory. The Kushites spent a considerable amount of time rebuilding the great monuments and temples. Now, this differs greatly from the Libyans and other Asiatic invaders who came to pillage and plunder. The Kushite pharaohs built columned temples with pylon gateways and added to the great Amun temple complex of Karnak. They also took the old kingdom's religious text and transferred them into stone for better preservation. An example of this is the Shabaka stone, named after the Nubian king who had it inscribed. On the stone, Shabaka added, "I found the writings of the ancients damaged, and I restored it better than it was."
They were fervent believers in Egypt's traditional gods, in some ways making them more Egyptian than the Egyptians. Beliefs that centered on this great sandstone mountain, Jebel Barkam. For centuries, it had been regarded as the mythical mound of creation. The mound from which Egypt's great creator god Amun was born.
Here is the holy mountain. This is where the god lived in his primeval form.
Dr. Tim Kendall has spent almost 30 years working at the site.
Being at the southern limit of the empire, it was where the Nile began, where fertility began, and so it had to be the place where creation began. So this was they imagined this as the birthplace of the god Amun.
As the Kushite kings gained increasing military power, they also claimed Egypt for themselves. So when King Pi led a Kushite invasion of Egypt in 747 BC, he didn't plunder or destroy, but restored and rebuilt, and founded Egypt's 25th dynasty.
Of rebirth, regrowth, redevelopment, and the Kushite kings are really kind of tapping into that ancient power source and just sort of giving it back to the Egyptians.
Starting time all over again.
Yeah.
And doing it right.
So they have that same sense of history and continuity as the Egyptians. They are the natural successors of the 18th dynasty kings.
And as such, the Kushites left a legacy of renewal and resurrection.
Africa is the only way out. It's the golden and it's the holy grail for your freedom. Like, if Americans, African Americans specifically, don't see that investing in Africa changes everything for you, I mean, all the way down to generational wealth. Like, Africa's in a position where if African Americans take position now, you guys, every single African American in America would be a millionaire without even thinking twice, because there's nothing that's not needed over there. So you guys come with the discipline, you come with the knowledge, you come with the resources, and then what you've created just for developing, nothing can happen really in a. Just think about everything that creates so much revenue for America, from sports to entertainment to fashion to medicine. I mean, you name it. We're leading in every single sector, like us. Just imagine if we all just decided to just take all our bags, withdrew all our money, and go to Africa. Because nothing would, nothing. Like all of our athletes can go create their own teams.